But why Brody? Why were you guys so fascinated with that story?
I think, well, mainly because I think it was something that has been forgotten a little bit. It's definitely out of the zeitgeist of wrestling. And for us, it was kind of an opportunity. And Jason and I first and foremost really got captivated with just who Bruiser Brody was as a person. I mean,
Yeah, I think so. I think like as kids, or like whenever we saw Bruiser Brody, it was kind of like you just saw that guy, and that was like you just thought that was just some like wild guy like wrestler. But then when you really read about who Frank Goodish was, like the person, that was like so fascinating, and you really realize like how like through Brody, he like his psychology and like how he developed his character, and how he protected the business and protected his character, was that I don't know was like that was like such an incredible like portrait of like an artist that I just never heard of an artist like that before, like someone who lives their character into their everyday public life. Like probably I think it was like the thing that just like it locked me in like right away was when I heard his wife like talk about how she was like, I never met like Bruiser Brody. Like she's like, I only knew Frank Goodish. And she would like take him and drop him off to the airport so he could go perform somewhere. And she said he would like kiss her goodbye. And as soon as he left the car, he would like pull out his like ponytail and his hair would like expand out. And she would see the character, like
the
Bruiser
transformation.
Brody the transformation, the character walk into the public.
Wow.
And that to me was like, oh, that is so crazy. Like where else like do you get that in performance art? No artists or actors ever, screw Daniel Day-Lewis. Like no one to that degree.
Jim Carrey. But there is like there's like the method acting side of it, but it's also the visuals of like any family photos. Like if you look at the family photos in the episode, it's like here's a guy who's like posing with his son who he loves very much, but he's got these like really insane like scars in his forehead, that he's just cut himself with, and it's really like these. I think the line between like who he was as a character and who he was in real life. I think some of the best feedback we've gotten on the episode is really from a lot, or at least from people in the business, is like, wow, I never saw that side of him. I never saw the Brody the father kind of side. And so that to us is just really fascinating. How you have these two completely compartmentalized personas, in this one guy. But then obviously, I think the real thing that hooked us, aside of that, of just being fans of Brody, was this idea that, since this murder story really is taking place in a kayfabe locker room, and the concept of the police coming in, not knowing what's real and what's fake. Right. And then also when this thing goes to trial, the jury who isn't smartened up, so to speak, is, watching footage of, or seeing photos or footage of Brody as this wild, out of control maniac.
Violent person.
And that's his persona that's painted to a jury. And then you really have this kind of just, gray area of, what's going on. And that later led to what, a lot of people feel was unjust in terms of what happened in that scenario. And of course, we'll never know exactly what happened. And that's also one of the other kind of tantalizing things about the story, too. So it had kind of all those ingredients, in order to tell a very compelling story to non-fans. And that's a huge part of the show, too, is that we really wanted to engineer this series to be accessible to people who aren't, like all of us on the call,
Yeah, and you mentioned different sides to Bruiser Brody. You hear from different things that he was this, great guy that, cared about the business, but that he could also be menacing and also... didn't have people that liked that, there were people that didn't like him. And so that added to the story. And then, of course, you bring Puerto Rico into it, which was, you hear the wrestlers tell the stories of visiting that place, which, besides the fans who would literally want to kill you and, promoters that might pay you, it just really adds to the intrigue of this story. And the fact that it was in another country. And how many different versions of this story did you hear? I mean, it seems like there are just so many. Like you said, we will never know the real truth. But how many different versions of this did you hear?
Well, doing a lot of the research on this story, and feel free to jump in, Jason. But for the most part, you hear from Tony Atlas and Dutch Mantell, who were present in the locker room, that day,
right.
And their account is mostly in sync of what they saw and what happened. And then, unfortunately, we weren't really able to get much of, the perspective of a lot of the Puerto Rican wrestlers because they declined to be interviewed for the piece.
They still don't want to talk about it, huh?
Still don't want to talk about it. But a lot of the newspapers at the time, Brody was a beloved wrestler in Puerto Rico, but at the same time, I think the way that it was kind of reported was, what was being put out in the defense, because nobody was really there on his behalf, or, Tony wasn't there, Dutch wasn't part of the trial. Most of it was, his word, Jose Gonzalez, the person who attacked him, it was his word over anybody else's, because there was there wasn't anybody else there to really say anything different. So, for the most part, we've heard other things over, since making the episode and some other stuff too. That's interesting. But, for the most part, this is primarily the version of the story that we've been told,
Well, and, the tragedy, too, is that he didn't have to die. They could, that must have been really incredible to hear these people tell it. And I've heard, Atlas tell the story. But, you're like, what? Why? Why did it take so long? Why didn't they help him?
Exactly. Yeah. And just all the, you hear about the extraneous factors of ambulance trying to get there, it being like lots of traffic, people not being able to load him in. And then, of course, he's not treated, at the hospital straight away.
And then you hear the other wrestlers were scared to step into it.
Yeah, right.
Well,
yeah, there's just so many different factors that went into this. Before we move on and talk about some of the other episodes, what was it about? Was there anything in this episode you felt you guys uncovered that maybe hadn't been brought out before?
God, it's been a minute now. I'm trying to think. I think
or what did you think the episode really put light on when after you sat and watched this?
Well, I think it was one aspect of the story that's kind of not been out there, which I think kind of gives gravity to the whole thing, is really Brody's son's interview. That he's never spoken to anybody about this before, and not just reporters or document. I mean, he hasn't done anything. I don't think he's ever talked to anybody about this before. And so that to us was, we were super grateful that, he was willing to speak to us, and, he trusted us. But, you really hear from him when you hear him talk about how, all these other people he meets or all these other people have memories of his father, but him, and that's just gut wrenching, in terms of that. So I think, hearing from Jeff and really understanding kind of, the weight of, the people that this really affected the most, is something that really, hadn't been out there. I
don't think David Manning's perspective had been out there either.
Yeah.
At least from him. I think he spoke to some of the rumors of Brody being owed money down there.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I don't think David Manning has talked about that before.